Started. I think everyone else is like popping in or here. So I'm going to talk about is the November, December, excuse me, 2020 PF topic. Jesse Mayer provided the initial slideshow, and then I made some edits, and we have a little presentation here. So this is the resolution, which I'm sure you're all familiar with at this point. The United States should adopt a declaratory policy of no first use. So I think there's a few key terms in the resolution. The one is, not necessarily in the order that you might think about them, but a declaratory policy. So this is a policy that we would make public. Debaters, at least policy debaters, used to like to talk about things being done in secret. This is clearly public, and it's legal. It makes a declaration in law. Now, obviously, if there's about to be a nuclear war, which is what is issued here, like how much we feel constrained by the law, it kind of begs the question a little bit. But the point is that we would make this a declaratory policy and kind of make it a statement of law. Second, no first use. What does that mean? It means that we're not the first nation to use a nuclear weapon in a conflict. Now, a lot of people kind of take that to mean that, okay, we're not going to wake up one day, we're going to decide, we're going to wake up one day and decide to nuke the Russians, right? That would certainly be the first use of nuclear weapons. But really what this means, and it is important to contextualize it in terms of kind of some of the situations in which this might arise, is that basically we're saying, look, if we're in a war with conventional weapons, or we're in a war with chemical and biological weapons, or we're subject to like a cyber attack, that we wouldn't be the first to use nuclear weapons in that conflict, that we would not respond to a conventional attack with nuclear weapons, right? And that does kind of become more meaningful because, a lot of people think, it's probably not a good idea to just wake up one day and nuke everyone in China, right? But if you really kind of think about it, it is kind of a bigger of an issue. Say, okay, what if we start losing a conventional war? What if one of our allies start losing a conventional war? We're still not going to be the first country to use nuclear weapons. That kind of makes the topic intuitively, right, like kind of more controversial. The other thing I want to emphasize is that it's a policy of no first use. Now, I think if the resolution didn't even say like adopt a policy of no first use, it would still kind of be a policy of no first use. That's been how this is debated in the past. But it's not, the important part here is that it's not just a statement. It's not just a statement where you say, oh, we're not going to use our nuclear weapons. Like, okay, that's like a little bit, right? Better than nothing, not super credible. But if you were to actually have a no first use policy that was meaningful, you would make kind of doctrinal changes. You would change your nuclear force structure. So what's a couple examples of things you might do? Well, one big thing people say would happen is that we would de-alert our nuclear weapons. What does that mean? It can mean a lot of different things. But for example, we might take the warheads off the missiles, right? So if you take your warheads off the missiles, your enemy knows it's kind of hard for you to initiate a nuclear first strike, right? Because they probably have good enough intelligence satellites to know you're actually doing this. You can debate all that, right? But if you really de-alert your weapons, it is hard to initiate a first strike, at least without your enemy knowing. A lot of people say we would eliminate our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, okay? Maybe we would shift more to sea-based, which could be good or bad. But a lot of people say that the weapons we use in first strike would come from land, and we might eliminate those entirely. Other people say we would withdraw, and I should have put this in here, withdraw our tactical nuclear weapons from Europe. Tactical nuclear weapons are small nuclear weapons. They kind of, so to speak, right? A nuclear weapon's a big bomb, but a small nuclear weapon that doesn't travel that far. That's especially relevant on this topic. These weapons are, because if you think about back to what I was talking about before, about how a conventional weapon, a conventional war could like escalate to the nuclear level. Right? Well, what if the Russians invaded Europe and we started losing a conventional battle, or allies started losing a conventional battle? That's what those tactical nuclear weapons are there for. So if we're not going to use nuclear weapons first, why would we have tactical nuclear weapons in Europe? Maybe we'd have to pull them out. You can debate about that. And like I say, there are likely additional posture changes to maybe make this policy credible. Like, so look, the pro is going to say, oh, well, this is a credible policy, right? Because a common negative argument, oh, come on, who's going to believe this, right? Well, we're going to make nuclear posture changes. Well, you can get disadvantage links there, clearly, right? Like, even you say, well, how much does saying we're not going to use nuclear weapons first, is that really going to reduce our deterrence much? maybe not, but if we like de-alert our nuclear weapons, we eliminate our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we get rid of our tactical nuclear weapons, that could a lot. All right, now what does this mean? What's our current policy? Well, generally speaking, we're not going to use nuclear weapons against the vast majorities of the world's countries. But it's a little more complicated than that. And arguably, maybe we could use them against a lot of countries. And this actually kind of gets at a real world. You talk about like topicality, which is starting to get a little bit into public forum. Those of you who have done other events, you know it's significant, like what the words mean. This starts to really demonstrate like how important like word choice is. So the Trump administration's 2018 nuclear posture review said the United States will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states, right? So non-nuclear weapon states that are parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is a treaty that kind of came about in the 1970s that was basically a deal. The countries that had nuclear weapons said, hey, we'll give up our nuclear weapons eventually. You know, this is a vague promise, okay? We'll eventually give up our nuclear weapons. Those countries that don't have them, you kind of commit not to developing them. And it's a treaty that has a lot of signatories, most of the world's countries and have ratified it. Now, obviously, the US really and the other powers haven't made much of a commitment to denuclearize. There really haven't been that many more countries that develop nuclear weapons. But the US is saying, if you've upheld your obligations and your compliance with these, like we won't be the first to use nuclear weapons with you. And that, like I say, this treaty covers a lot of countries. So it seems like this is a pretty broad commitment. So in some technical sense, people say that really the only countries that are a question here are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Why? Well, China and Russia are our foes, right? The UK has nuclear weapons, but we're not about to get into a nuclear war with them. Same with India. Pretty unlikely we're having a nuclear war with Pakistan, right? But China, Russia, you have Iran, which is not, the US says is not in compliance with its treaty obligations, and clearly North Korea, which is like developed nuclear weapons and withdrawn from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So most people say like kind of those are the countries that's kind of at issue. But arguably it could be a lot more countries because the Trump administration expanded the nuclear posture review to expand the definition of extreme. What does that mean? Well, Obama and the Trump administration both said the US would only consider the use of nuclear weapons first in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States or its allies and partners, right? So we're both kind of agree that like we'd only use these in extreme circumstances. But Obama said extreme means a narrow range of contingencies, okay, and emphasized the goal was to continue to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in deterring non-nuclear attacks and to rely on diplomacy, okay? He's just kind of saying like only in these really extreme narrow range of contingencies. Trump said to broaden the definition of extreme circumstances to include significant non-nuclear attacks. Significant non-nuclear attacks include, but are not limited to, attacks on our allies or nuclear forces. It's expanded to include economic threats, could include cyber attacks, trade embargoes, or terrorist attacks, right? So now there's a lot more circumstances under which we might be the first to use nuclear weapons. Now you might kind of say that's like a little bit vague. Like, what does this mean? This is super ambiguous. Yes, it is. It's called calculated ambiguity. You read about nuclear deterrence, you'll read about calculated ambiguity, and it's like we're being deliberately ambiguous. Why? Because arguably that creates a little bit of deterrence. Like we're not really sure, right? Like exactly like when we wouldn't use these weapons, it keeps our kind of enemies on their toes. Now the downside, of course, they could get very nervous and you could have like some nuclear crisis escalation happening, okay? But it is designed to be ambiguous. It's obviously much more ambiguous maybe under the Trump administration than under the Obama administration, but both sides have kind of embraced this calculated ambiguity. As we'll talk about, the Obama administration really seriously considered adopting a nuclear no first use posture, but ultimately decided against it because our allies were opposed to it, which creates incredibly strong negative ground on this topic. All right, there is some other literature that's directly related to this. Some people argue that this is still a bit ambiguous, but that the sole purpose, we should say the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear use, to kind of stop them from happening. Okay, now maybe we could still use them first to like kind of deter or demonstrate or whatever, but it's sole purpose. It's a little bit different from no first use in that regard, right? It's not as clean of a prohibition, and it still creates a little bit of ambiguity, but not as much. In policy debate, a lot of times when people would argue on the pro for no first use, the con would counterclaim with sole purpose, kind of debate the distinction. You can't do that in public forum. But the reason I highlight this is when you're researching there will be a lot of articles that are advocating sole purpose that would, also the arguments are basically the same for no first use. It's the same kind of types of situations that we'll talk about when we get into the pro arguments. But even though that's not in the resolution, I want to bring that to your attention because I don't want you to find articles on sole purpose and just be like, well, these are about sole purpose, not no first use. Very, very similar. Okay, now under what conditions might it make sense to use nuclear weapons first? Well, there are some, right? Okay, if we want to eliminate our enemy, so if we're just tired of the Russians, right? We might want to kind of wake up one day, the bolt from the blue attack, nuke them before they have a chance to nuke back, right? And in the old days, we'd say take over the world. Now we have China to deal with, right? We could kind of basically incinerate one of our major enemies. The second is because maybe we are fearful that we are about to be attacked. So like we think the Russians are going to launch a nuclear strike on us. We're pretty convinced of it, right? So, hey, let's take them out. We could also maybe say when we are attacked with conventional weapons that are maybe like more than we can deal with, or at least in a particular situation, or attacked with chemical and biological weapons, or cyber weapons. A lot of you probably debated the topic last year, right? Like offensive cyber operations. Well, what if we were kind of getting overrun in an offensive cyber conflict? Okay, time to pull out the nuclear weapons. What about these AI drone swarms, artificial intelligence? What if we kind of keep losing the artificial intelligence race to China and we just can't beat them in AI and they like kind of overwhelm us and we start to lose? We're just supposed to suck it up, right? Be like, hey, we surrender, like we surrendered to the coronavirus. We're going to surrender to, okay, your artificial intelligence drones, right? So it's like, maybe it's time to take out the nuclear weapons. What if our allies are attacked with any of these weapons, right? And they can't defend themselves. Or if the Japanese can't defend themselves, or if the Germans can't defend themselves. But the one thing that I kind of gave kind of the discussion of this earlier. In the first two scenarios, we are starting a war, right? We decide we want to eliminate our enemy, or we decide our enemy is about to like kind of attack us. So we launch our nuclear weapons. And the second, it's like we kind of are escalating the war, right? Like, hey, you're attacking us with these different types of weapons or whatever, and we're losing. That's probably would be more the scenario. Not like, gee, somebody launched a cyber attack on us, so we launched a nuke. That's kind of unlikely, right? But if we kind of get into a bind and we can't survive with our conventional forces against these types of attacks, and maybe we would like escalate to the nuclear level. What other countries have no first use policies? Well, China has an unconditional no first use policy since it first developed nuclear weapons in 1964. And go back to de-alerting, most people say that their weapons are de-alerted. You can find evidence on both sides, like conservatives saying, oh, they're about to like remake the warheads. There's definitely a bit of debate as to the status, but most people think that at least they're currently still de-alerted, which makes their no first use credible. Russia had a no first use policy from 1982 to 1993, right? But at the time it was the Soviet Union. When they collapsed, right, and the US expanded its kind of NATO alliances into Eastern Europe, Russia's economy like kind of was in the toilet. They couldn't sustain the conventional force structure that they had. They said, hey, we're not going to have no first use anymore. Well, why did they do that? I mean, think about it. They thought they could lose a conventional war with the United States. Okay, India adopted a conditional no first use policy. It reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if Indian forces are attacked with biological or chemical weapons, right? So they say, oh, we'll have no first use unless you come at us with chemical or biological weapons. Pakistan doesn't have one. Pakistan developed nuclear weapons, disclosed that they had nuclear weapons, okay, but they won't have a no first use policy. Why do you think India has a no first use policy and not Pakistan? Anybody? Class? I'll give you the answer. Pakistan's small, right? If India attacks Pakistan and it's just a conventional war, like India's probably going to win. If Pakistan attacks India and it's just a conventional war, India's probably going to win. So, you know, we can debate about what's nice to do. Like, should we have, right, these types of policies? Okay, but in the end, like, people are protecting their self-interest in what's likely war, conventional war. It's unlikely the US would lose a conventional war to like any country, at least over time, like even if they got like kind of a big advantage or a head start, but our allies could lose. And we have commitments to defend our allies. Now, what are some potential pro arguments? So look, and I'll say this at the end, public forum debate, judges don't believe in nuclear war. Judges don't believe in catastrophes. I always like to tell this story. At Penn in 2020, I helped my team write a case that says the coronavirus is going to come and spread around the world, crash the economy. We needed a UBI to save people's lives, okay, and to sustain the economy. Every judge we argued this case in front of said, that's absolutely ridiculous. The coronavirus is never like going to spread anywhere. And if it does, it's not going to affect the economy. Okay, judges do not like catastrophes. Okay, even though this topic is about nuclear war, they're still going to kind of have the opinion that nuclear war is probably not going to happen. And, you know, obviously the chances of a nuclear war happening are kind of relatively small. Okay, it's just that both arguments on both sides are about nuclear war. I say this here, not to just simply state the obvious and kind of point out that you're stuck with this, but that we are talking about very low risk things. Right. So when I talk about these things, you might be like, well, there's basically almost no chance of that happening. And I'll say, you're right. There is almost no chance of that happening. Okay. But that's kind of true on both sides. So the first thing is we could have a miscalculated war. Remember, I talked about strategic ambiguity. Very ambiguous. What is your policy? What are you going to do with these weapons? It's getting a little kind of US-China relations are getting worse. There's potential for conflict over Taiwan. US-Russian relations are getting worse. There's a potential for somebody getting really angry about a Russian election interference or Russian activity in the Ukraine. Okay, well, when tensions are high and you think maybe somebody's going to attack you, you might miscalculate and think, well, gee, we better attack now, or you might think you're going to be attacked by them because the situation is bad. You could have a miscalculated war. You could also have an accidental war. An accidental war is literally like an accident. That's not like a miscalculation. An accidental war is when there's like the flock of geese that fly over the radar and somebody thinks they're nuclear weapons and they shoot off a weapon. Well, if there's a flock of geese flying across the radar and your weapons are demated and you don't have your tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and you don't have your land-based ICBMs, you're probably not going to just respond to that, okay, with a nuclear war. Okay, so with chance of accidental war, super low. Impact, obviously, quite catastrophic. Okay, but the chances of a nuclear war happening are like very, very, by accident, are very, very small. But look, no first use, okay, clarifies the US stance. It's a declaratory policy. It involves changes in force structure that would make accidental and miscalculated wars less likely. Like, that's just like a simple reality, right? That it would make those less likely. Now, what else could this do? What are some other benefits? It could rein in presidential power. I mean, when Trump was first elected, you know, there's this evidence that Trump just goes shoot off nuclear weapons. I mean, it's not that easy, right? People have their own political opinions on that. But, you know, there's always a danger of kind of a crazy leader. Like, it's kind of hard for a crazy leader to be like, different to just order a nuclear first strike than it is to order the like reconstitution of the arsenal, which it doesn't take 5 minutes, right? It doesn't take 5 minutes to put your warheads on your missiles, okay, and launch a first strike. The other thing is commitment trap. Commitment trap gets into deterrence arguments. What does that mean? Well, what is a commitment trap? A commitment trap happens because, say the US pledges that we'll use nuclear weapons first in defense of our allies, which essentially we have, right? And the Russians start to overrun Germany. The US has two options. We can use nuclear weapons and start a nuclear war, or we cannot use nuclear weapons and our deterrence will be like lost because we haven't fulfilled our commitment. Like, what do the Russians think then? Like, once they overrun Germany and we don't shoot the nuclear weapons, do they think we're going to shoot the nuclear weapons when they overrun the UK? right? Or does Japan think we're going to shoot the nuclear weapons when China overruns them, right? So we're kind of stuck in this dilemma. And either way, you kind of lose, right? You either start a nuclear war, which is bad, right? Or you don't shoot. And we might not shoot. Like you may have heard the expression, we're not going to give up New York to save Berlin. What does that mean? That means that we're not going to shoot a nuclear weapon at Russia to save Germany, because we know the Russians will like shoot nuclear weapons at New York, and we're not going to trade that. So some people think like the pledge is like not even credible. And if we actually acted on it, it would force us like into this terrible commitment trap of doing nothing or shooting a nuclear weapon at the Russians. So people argue that this commitment trap is destabilizing and undermines deterrence, which is like, hey, you know, you're probably thinking like deterrence is kind of like a major negative argument here. So we got to kind of think how I'm going to answer, okay? Could have an arms race. You could say the US policy, like think about it. If you're one of our enemies, right? Like if you're Russia or North Korea or China, think, well, gee, the US says they might use nuclear weapons first and they won't deny that they will. So we better get like our nuclear arsenal in tip-top shape. Not only do we have to get it kind of in tip-top shape generally, but we have to make it big. Why? Because if the US strikes first, we need to have a second strike capability. We need to assume that maybe they're going to be able to take out half our nuclear weapons. Like if we only have 10 and they take them all out, we're toast, right? So let's make 100. So then we have like maybe at least 50 left to retaliate. Okay, so that could encourage arms races. It could also encourage nuclear proliferation, both the spread of, which refers to the spread of nuclear weapons, both because other countries think like we are about to attack them, or more importantly, people say, remember, this non-proliferation treaty is a bargain. It's a bargain between the first world powers, like who had nuclear weapons, and those who didn't give them, kind of decided not to give them up. Well, if we continue to emphasize the role of nuclear weapons in our policy and threaten things like first strikes or escalation with nuclear weapons in conventional war, then this non-proliferation regime is going to be a road. Now, people have been making this argument since I debated in the 1980s. Okay, the non-proliferation regime is like on the brink of collapse. All right, if we don't take it credibly, like don't do stuff to like strengthen it and kind of at least move in a direction of like disarmament a little bit, de-emphasize the role of nuclear weapons, this regime will collapse. The regime's going to help. Okay, India, Pakistan, North Korea have gone nuclear. People think Israel has nuclear weapons. They just haven't disclosed them. Maybe Iran will go nuclear. We don't really know. But if you think about that over 30, 40, 50 years, it's been a pretty successful thing, at least in slowing the rate of nuclear proliferation. Some people make arguments about China, that China is considering rolling back its nuclear no first use pledge due to US policy, and then maybe they keep it if we adopt one. You know, who knows? India model. Maybe India will switch. Maybe they'll abandon theirs. Maybe Israel will abandon like whatever it has. People say there's a big debate. Like Israel probably has 200 nuclear weapons. They won't tell anybody they do. Why? Because they think if they came out and said we have 200 nuclear weapons, that would be like saying we intend to use them at this point. Why else at this point would you come out and say it? So their policy, it's called they're an opaque proliferator. They haven't really said they have nuclear weapons, but most people think they do. There's debates about Iran. Okay, like is Iran, it's kind of probably not a good argument, but people say that strengthening the non-proliferation regime is important to containing Iran. Well, so is the support of our allies, and our allies would like be very upset, okay, if we adopted no first use policy. There's arguments about soft power, just like, hey, we'd be seen as like a nicer country if we adopted this no first use policy, that this would respect international law as part of the NPT. You know, there's these kind of vague arguments that kind of make a little better in policy debate than in PF because it's hard to impact them. Some people make arguments about costs, like, oh, it costs us a lot of money to like maintain all these like land-based forces and things. I think these arguments are terrible. Like if we got rid of, and this will help set up a whole other category of like negative arguments. Just think if we decide not to have a no first use policy and we de-alert our weapons and we take our tactical nuclear weapons out of Europe, maybe we get rid of our land-based ICBMs. Well, we're not just going to stop there. Like we're going to make other changes, right? That by effect, like the US would kind of also not topically, you can't do this in your plan. Like, well, you don't have a plan, but you know what I mean? You can't do this as part of your advocacy of no first use. But negative teams are going to say, look, if we suddenly have this reduction, right, in our ability to kind of escalate to the nuclear level, if we start to get defeated, then we're going to invest a lot more into conventional weapons. And the con can say some very deadly conventional weapons. Moving on to the con arguments. Well, what are some con arguments? Like, there's a couple things that are kind of grounded in the foreign policy idea of realism. Realism says countries, like people, always act in their best interest, right? So it's kind of based on this philosophical idea that humans are kind of inherently self-interested, maybe even a little bit bad. Okay, and we always act out for our own self-interest. Well, countries are run by people, and the leaders of these countries are already going to always look out for their own self-interest. What does that mean for this topic? You don't have to make this argument so complex. I don't think your lay judges are going to care about a discussion of foreign policy realism. But what it means is that two things, like A, no one's going to believe this commitment, right? Now you can make your nuclear posture change arguments, okay? But nobody's really going to believe this. It's not going to be credible. And B, we shouldn't do it because like no one, you know, other people are like going to in secret, like keep their warheads mated. So China will say, hey, thanks. Yeah, we were considering changing our no first use policy to a policy of first use. Thanks a lot. We'll keep no first use. But then, you know, in secret, they're putting like they're mating their missiles back to their warhead. Same with the Russians, okay? Maybe we keep some, you know, maybe somebody keeps some tactical nuclear weapons somewhere. Just like a solvency type argument, but a little bit of offense, right? With the potential for it's like not in our best interest. Then there's deterrence argument. There's a couple different types of deterrence arguments that are kind of overlap a little bit, but you can kind of make them a little distinct. One is de-escalation. There are a lot of kind of advocates essentially of like nuclear deterrence and nuclear use who say like if a conventional conflict got out of hand, we should launch a nuclear weapon. That'll just de-escalate the conflict. Obviously that's risky, it could escalate. There's a debate between escalation and de-escalation. You can make the argument there that it like deters like conventional conflicts. The second is we might need to deter chemical and biological warfare. Might need to deter a cyber attack. Okay, maybe we need to deter, and here you can talk about, and this is why conventional forces matter a lot, right? Like in some ways, deterrence against nuclear forces is enhanced by calculated ambiguity. But look, if North Korea nukes, like launches a nuclear weapon at LA, like we're gonna respond with like lots of nuclear weapons, okay? If North Korea decides to launch a nuclear weapon into South Korea, that'd be kind of crazy because they're like right on the border, but like maybe they try to hit the southern part of South Korea or something like that. We're going to retaliate with nuclear weapons. Like that's a given. That's not affected by this policy. That's like reality. But what if North Korea launches a conventional invasion of South Korea? They have an overwhelming force like advantage. They could obliterate Seoul, okay, in like a month. Okay, just probably with artillery shells. All right, they could just kind of like wreck the place, okay. But okay, eventually, like most of our troops there that are currently stationed there would die. That's like a given. We can move the 50 or 60,000 troops into Japan from Japan into South Korea and like battle back up to the north. Okay, we can bring other troops in. We probably could eventually repel a North Korean invasion. Like we have all our bombers, right? Like, you know, eventually we could get them back. But look, if we were to follow this no first use policy, as long as they didn't use a nuclear weapon, we couldn't do anything. So what, we're just going to let Seoul be overrun. We're going to let them invade the place with artillery shells. We're going to let them use cyber weapons to like destroy all of South Korea's power infrastructure, trigger nuclear accidents in their power plants. We're going to let them launch CBWs against South Korea and be like, okay, that's cool, but you know, we just don't want to break like the nuclear barrier. Right, so you kind of see if like we did this and we actually held to it, it could undermine deterrence because we probably would need nuclear weapons, all right, in the event of like a full-scale like North Korean invasion of South Korea. We could arguably need nuclear weapons if Russia invaded Europe or China invaded Taiwan, right? Even at a conventional level, and maybe that's why we need those tactical nuclear weapons there. Maybe why we need nuclear bunker busters. Bunker busters are weapons that like kind of burrow into the ground and like destroyed bunkered or protected forces. Okay, so there are different scenarios under which we could use deterrent. We need deterrence. I do want to emphasize that you're primarily talking about deterring conventional attacks, right? Because we would retaliate for a nuclear attack. All right, that doesn't really change too much. You can make other arguments about why, it is important to first use is like the calculated ambiguity of first use is important to deter nuclear attacks, those types of things. I'm not saying don't make any arguments about nuclear deterrence, but a lot of this, because we threaten to use nuclear weapons in response to attacks through these other means, that I think is where the stronger arguments are. Now, look, this deterrence debate can get pretty complicated. Okay, like how much do these things matter at the margins? Like, what about all our other weapons? Like, okay, then you have like the commitment trap argument on the pro to deal with. There's a whole bunch of arguments about whether threatened nuclear retaliation is even credible in the first place. Like, right, we're going to trade New York for Berlin. This debate is big and like messy and like complicated, and it's going to get nickeled and dimed. And we all know public forum judges treat nickel and dime arguments like absolutes, right? Like, so it's a tough, not that you can't win it, it's a tough road. What's easier for the con? There's a couple things. I think there's two arguments related to our allies, and I think the second one's even easier. Our allies would not like this. Like I said, we know they would not like this. Obama really seriously pushed this, and he pushed it with our allies, and he tried to convince them to go along with it. And they're like, no. Why? Because we have what's called extended nuclear deterrence. We extend our nuclear deterrence to protect our allies from invasions. We kind of make a deal where, like Japan, we'll come and defend you. We'll not let you get overrun. We'll use our nuclear weapons first if necessary if you do not develop nuclear weapons. Why? Well, if you read anything about world history, Japan used to be an imperial power, right? World War II, okay? People in Asia, they're kind of afraid of Japan. They want, if Japan started developing nuclear weapons, so would all other countries around the area. South Korea would probably develop nuclear weapons. Other countries would develop more nuclear weapons. The Russians wouldn't even like this. Okay, probably touch off an arms race with China, who Japan has invaded. Okay, so the US kind of made a deal after World War II. It said, like, look, do not develop nuclear weapons. We will defend you. Same with Germany, right? Like Germany ended. People did not like the Germans, right? Like they just invaded like the whole continent, right? Okay, killed 6 million Jews, right? So we're kind of, nobody really wanted them to have nuclear weapons either. So, okay, it's like, hey, you don't develop nuclear weapons, we'll defend you. And then other places, it's a little more indirect, like, right? Like Saudi Arabia is not going to develop nuclear weapons because they think we're going to defend them. Well, what if they thought we would no longer defend Germany or Japan, right? Or like Taiwan, they're like South Korea, right? Like they're next, right? So they're going to get nervous. So the argument is that if we don't threaten to use or retain our threat to use nuclear weapons first, in the event that these countries are attacked by outside armies with conventional forces, then they'll develop their own nuclear weapons. The evidence on this is like phenomenal. Okay, it's really been better than anything that says like no first use. Like now, right? I think it's all relative, right? Like reduce the risk of accidental war, like miscalculation, right? Well, like A, okay, those are like inherently small risks. B, what do you think? Like, think there'd be like a bigger risk of accidents or miscalculation if a whole bunch of countries that never previously had nuclear weapons got them, right? Some people say the US and Russia just kind of lucked out they didn't have a nuclear war because along those, those first 30, 50 years of having the arsenals, we kind of got lucky and we developed communication mechanisms and we established nuclear doctrines and safety procedures. And look, we were separated by an ocean. We weren't really historical enemies, right? All these things kind of worked in favor of us not having like a nuclear war, whether it's intentional, accidental, or miscalculated, right? But take all these historical enemies that are geographically near each other, which have nuclear weapons for the first time, and like hope for the best. Okay, and then look, even if your judges, and this I think helps the con a little bit, your judges don't think a nuclear war is going to happen, our allies would be angry. Like at the very least, even if they don't decide to get nuclear weapons and then we have like all these kind of chain reaction consequences that may be hard to convince your public forum judges of, okay, they're going to be mad, right? So think about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They're going to be mad for a couple reasons. A, we have agreed to defend our NATO allies with nuclear weapons. B, any changes we make are supposed to go through like consultative procedures and like get their buy-in. Like we're just going to unilaterally adopt a no first use policy like out of the blue? Or we're just going to tell them we decided to do this? They're going to be like furious with us. This is going to undermine, even if it doesn't split the NATO alliance, because some PF judges too, we learned on other topics, they just don't believe the NATO alliance could ever collapse. okay? But it would undermine cohesion within the NATO alliance. It would cause a lot of fighting. It would make it difficult for us to get along. That is true. And there is good evidence that says that the Russians kind of saw like a lot of infighting in the alliance, they could be more aggressive. But beyond that, right, it could make cooperation on other issues such as counterterrorism difficult. You know, too, and I think this is a really good argument, is that if you debated last year's Belt Road Initiative topic, you know that China is trying to get Europe to adopt its Huawei 5G technology. A lot of people think that they can use this to spy, they can disrupt communication networks, they can use it to monitor our military movements. The US has at least been somewhat successful in pushing these European countries, okay, away from this like 5G technology. Well, what if the alliance splits? So there's a lot of infighting. They're not going to care that much what we say about it anymore. They're going to be mad at us, right? That's like an issue where there's kind of a little bit of like, that is a practical thing you can see changing. They have swayed back and forth. You could argue that. Other countries say, look, it'd be bad if Europe spent more money on its defense. This would trade off with like social welfare spending. But anyhow, there's arguments you can make about why it's just bad to like undermine these relations with our countries. And really, even for the most lay judge, you can say, why would we want to alienate our allies? Allied relationships have kept the peace. We came about with these after World War II to protect the peace. We should help our friends. Our friends help us, right? Even if you don't want to go into war, like certain scenarios, okay, you can like you can cover it that way. That gets you kind of out of that. Conventional war. It could make conventional war more likely, right? If there's no threat of like escalation to a nuclear level, maybe we were more likely to have conventional wars. It's just kind of like a basic argument. Some people say we would invest more. The evidence that says like we would invest more in conventional weapons if we got rid of nuclear no first use is really good. Okay. So then you could say like, generally conventional wars are more likely, which judges like, well, hopefully at least by that, like conventional wars do start, though sometimes I don't always know. I mean, we had a topic with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and sometimes the judges would say there's like, come on, a war is never going to happen, even though we were just like debating about a war in Yemen. But okay, they're probably more likely to see that is related, it's likely to happen than like a nuclear war. Okay, then there's other things if you can get into. It's like, oh, we're going to adopt precision guided munitions. That could really scare the Russians. If the pros reading impacts about accidental or miscalculated war, those precision guided munitions could make it like a lot worse. Maybe there's a greater shift or a faster shift to artificial intelligence. So there is really good evidence that says if we had no first use, we would shift from counter value to counter force targeting. Counter force targeting to counter value targeting. What's the difference? Counter force is like when you, target the nuclear forces of another country, or you like target the infrastructure that sustains their military. Counter value is when you just like target their population and like try to kill as many people as possible. Well, if we're kind of only use nuclear weapons kind of later in the conflict or after we were attacked, there's evidence that says we try to shift more to counter value targeting to create deterrence. You can say that that would have a much bigger impact if a war broke out. There's all, as you can imagine, huge debates on the morality of like counter value targeting. You can say generally our hegemony would be undermined. Now you can say proliferation is good. Now look, if the pro says, hey, we saved the NPT, the non-proliferation treaty, we stop nuclear proliferation, you could just respond and say nuclear proliferation is good, that creates deterrence. It's more complicated than that, but yeah, generally. But obviously you can't say on the con like, hey, you cause our allies to go nuclear and then say nuclear proliferation is good. So you'd have to choose. But I'm just kind of throwing that argument out there. I think there's some key questions that you want to kind of think about. First of all, will no first use reduce proliferation by strengthening the non-proliferation regime? Or will it increase it? Or will, right, it increase nuclear proliferation by reducing the credibility of the security commitments to our allies? Which link is stronger, right? Because the pro is going to say, hey, we reduce nuclear proliferation this way. The con is going to say, you increase it this way. As I'll say a million times to public forum debaters, just because one of these is true does not mean the other is false, right? Like just because the pro wins that like the nuclear proliferation, the NPT credibility argument, does not deny the allies' security fears argument, or vice versa. Like you have to debate each of those and then argue which one is more likely. It's like a critical question. I mean, it might not happen in every debate, obviously, but I can see it happening in a lot of debates. Second of all, what's a better link to deterrence? A commitment trap or a commitment not to use nuclear weapons first? Like, does that commitment trap undermine deterrence a lot? Or like, hey, do we not have deterrence against like conventional force escalation? What's more likely to cause a war? More threatening nuclear postures or a greater reliance on conventional weapons, including precision-guided munitions, cyber warfare, AI-based weapons, right? Like, do you really think if we adopted a no first use policy, that just says we're not going to use our nuclear weapons first? It doesn't say we won't use like dramatic escalation of cyber weapons first. It doesn't say we won't use AI weapons first. Heck, maybe we develop some chemical and biological, or we have chemical weapons, supposedly biological. We could develop more of those and use those first. Like, so what's more dangerous, right? And then you can say, like, does NFU or changes in our nuclear posture cost more or less? Like I say, I don't think those arguments are great, but maybe those would be a little more persuasive to lay judges. Pro-framework arguments. You know, world survival. It sounds good on the pro, though, like, I think the con's going to say, like, you know, you increase the risk of nuclear war. You could say liberalism or neoliberalism. Liberalism says that like people are inherently good, like we got to figure out frameworks to get along. Neoliberalists say that people can be bad, but we can kind of constrain them like with these agreements, like the NPT, right? So even if the realists are a little bit right, that people do a lot of things that are not in their best interest, we can't constrain them with laws, which is like, you know, kind of how we live. Social constructivists say the way we understand the world and what's important is like really important. So social constructivists could say, if you have no first use, you can kind of like reduce the significance of nuclear weapons, reduce their meaning, reduce their value, kind of create a social norm against their use, which can help. Utility, obviously, what is the best for the great majority of people? World cooperation probably goes more with like liberalism and neoliberalism, but those are some framework ideas. The con, right? I already mentioned realism. What would a rational actor in the real world do? You got deterrence on the con, hegemony, maybe a general argument about how we have to defend our allies. Like you can kind of play the allied argument both ways. You could kind of have the contention about, you know, how in this modern world we really have to respect our allies and get along. Oh, the one other argument that I read recently was kind of interesting, is that, you know, artificial intelligence, the strength of artificial intelligence is really like largely determined by how much data you have. Obviously, how you analyze it is important, right? Because AI reacts based on like kind of how would react in like an appropriate situation. So it has to gather all this data essentially to help to make the machine learn. Well, China has 1.5 billion people. So it has weak privacy laws. So it has a lot of data and a lot of opportunities for its AI to advance. The US only has like 330 million people. Okay, so how are we ever going to compete? How are we ever going to get all the data that we need? Well, just think, if we got all the data from our allies too, okay, like we'd have a chance to compete in the world of shared data and got along well, chance to compete in the world of kind of artificial intelligence. But you could make some general arguments about like, hey, like for lay judges, like, hey, like I said, we have these allies, they're important. Like after World War II, things have basically worked. We haven't had any huge international conflicts. We all need to get along together. We need to be respectful of other people's security interests and security concerns. Okay, I think you could kind of phrase it that way. A few things just kind of at the end. Remember the con, again, this is like the last topic, right? The pro is arguing a change, like an old like policy topic, right? The pro is arguing we should adopt Medicare for all. Here they're arguing we should adopt no first use. Okay, the con is arguing for maintaining the status quo, calculating ambiguity. Can't counterplan in PF, that's one thing for the most part. 99.9% of PF debates, you can't read a counterplan. So you're pretty good. It's like the status quo. The pro does need leverage versus con offense, right? We talked about the NPT versus allies, commitment trap versus deterrence. Judges don't blame in nuclear war. So where do we go? Talk about our allies, maybe on the pro, talk about how we shouldn't sacrifice our own interests for those of our allies. I don't know. That's most of, that's generally kind of what I have. I'll take questions. You could type them in the chat now that I can look in the chat, or you could ask them out loud. Or you could make a random statement. You disagree with something I said, or you have another argument. Anything is fair game.
So considering Puff is such a evidence-heavy debate, and as we were talking about, a lot of these things don't necessarily have good statistics to back them up, since it's all a lot of chance. Do you have tips on how to balance the lack of empirics?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that's another good point that I should have made, right? PF's also a lot about statistics. I say that statistics in PF are like the nuclear war in policy. Judges won't believe anything unless there's like some random statistical thing from some totally random study. Okay, so what, that's a reality. I don't like it, but it is a reality. How can you deal with it? Well, there's a few places that you can find statistics. Okay, you can find statistics about like whether or not arms races lead to war. Now, they're not large probabilities, but I've heard PF debaters read cards. This is like, if there's an arms race, like there's like a 2% increase in the probability of war. Okay. Second, you can kind of make some comparisons. Obviously, we've only had one nuclear war, right? So the chance of a conventional war is much higher, right? The US is the only country to use nuclear weapons. We used them once. Okay, and it's interesting. We did use them in response to fear of like we were going to get overrun by conventional forces. So you could always talk about that where it's relevant, right? Okay, but we only use nuclear weapon once. Conventional wars happen like all the time. Okay, so the third thing is like you can try to look in the nuclear proliferation literature about like, so you can look at in there about like any cards you might be able to find about like statistical probability increase in nuclear war. I don't think you're going to find much there, but there is this literature about security dilemmas, right? Like when countries feel insecure, it's the security dilemma refers to the idea that like as one country becomes more secure, another country becomes less secure. So it's like a little bit of a dilemma. Like I want to imagine that if I secure myself by buying 6 guns to protect myself against you, you're going to kind of fear that like offensively, right? It kind of creates a little bit of dilemma. I become more secure, you become less secure, you go buy 7 guns, right? So there's evidence that kind of says those security dilemmas like increase the risk of war. As far as some of these other arguments, it's tough, right? Like there isn't going to be a card that says if we adopt no first use, there's a 6.7% chance that our allied relationship with Japan will be destroyed. Like they're just like that evidence does not exist, right? Like there's really no evidence that says that like if we adopt no first use, there's like a 48% increased chance that the NPT is going to be resolved. So you can try to kind of look for, you want to look for these kind of arguments in like other contexts, like I say, like arms races, and like try to apply them. And then like, I think you should say like your opponent doesn't like have any statistics. That's really kind of about the best I have to offer. Now we have many experienced coaches in here. So I don't know if they would also like to chime in with any advice on that. I know Paul is here or was here. I know Mr. Dolan is still here. Yeah, Paul is still here. Anyone have any advice?
Well, I'll throw a couple of things in. The first is that there really is going to be a lot of probability argumentation on here, with both sides trying to minimize the probability that's offered by the other side. And I think this is a topic where persuasion is actually going to come back into the event, because of one of the things that the young lady was just saying, because of this lack of empirics or data. And actually, Stefan, I think many judges in PF today now have the opposite feeling about stats. We don't believe any stats that PF
so many of them, right? Yeah.
Right. Well, they misuse them so much, non-intentionally, intentionally, I don't care what. They're just not used correctly. And I can't believe I have to listen to 2.3 million healthcare workers be 2.3 million doctors for another tournament now. And nobody point out that it's not doctors. Kills me. But anyway, or 900 million people being dumped into poverty by a recession. Yeah, I love that card too. So I really think that a lot of these stats are going to come out, and there's going to need to be something in there where you're going to actually have to try to persuade someone that you have a logical policy. One area that I think it might be productive to look at is a very real world situation of the place that the United States currently holds in the world, and what establishing a policy like this might do for US credibility, for the fact that how other nations view us, for how we might um, given a particular result in the upcoming presidential election, how we might be able to use it to help reestablish relationships. I think there are these kinds of things that we might start to look at rather than just the standard, who's going to blow up whom type of arguments.
Yeah, I really like that. I was thinking, oh yeah, that would really make a lot of sense if like Biden wins, because then you'd say like, well, hey, I know PF doesn't use so much like fiat or time, but like this would be one of the first policies of like a new administration, right? So it really kind of change like how we want, at least how the U.S. is trying to orient itself towards the world. Now, if Trump wins, right, this is going to be like one like oddball policy amongst many different types. He has definitely a different approach to the world. But yeah, I think that has a lot of potential. And I also kind of want to reemphasize what Mr. Dolan said about the persuasion. Like persuasion, if you look at like rhetorical theory, works to get you kind of like where there is a gap in data or data is missing. Like we don't know for certain, right, that the Earth, we know that like global temperatures like increased on average, but we don't know for certain like what the consequences of that are going to be, right? So people are kind of using data and then trying to convince people, right, that certain things are going to happen where there's like a gap in the data. If the data is like all there, like we know 2 + 2 = 4, right? There's no room for persuasion, but the persuasion comes in where you don't have that exact data. So my path to kind of trickery, right? Like, yeah, I mean, throw in a stat, maybe it'll help, but it can create a downside, like Mr. Dolan said. Like, I actually had a controversy at the Georgetown tournament because the debaters got upset that the judge wanted them to just show them like every piece of evidence like by default. Like when you present a speech, the judge like wanted you to post all your evidence, like kind of in the chat, right? And the debaters didn't really like this. It's pretty normal in policy and PF, but I mean policy and LD. PF debaters don't like this. Okay, so I went and talked to the judge, and the judge said, like, well, he said, look, I understand. He said, but I'm just tired of hearing like all these like statistics. He's like, a lot of times the statistics aren't even in the evidence that the debaters are referencing. They're just doing their own calculations. He says, and how's the other team even supposed to debate them? Like, the other team, like, rattles off all these statistics. What, in the crossfire, you're supposed to ask for like all their evidence and go through it? He's like, I'm just trying to make them honest. Right. So like, I get like why the debaters didn't like this. I understand like kind of maybe why the coach was like, this is kind of like not conventional, but I understood where the judge was coming from completely. Right. Like, how can you have a debate where people are just rattling off like all these totally random statistics? And then when you ask them for their card, they take a minute to find each statistic. Right. So I kind of like appreciate the fact that there is kind of this like kind of backlash against kind of maybe the over statistization, right, of evidence. So maybe you could take advantage of that. But regardless, like I think we all agree that you have to. Like there just aren't, like I've coached this topic before in high school and college, like multiple times. Like there just aren't cards in this literature that in international relations in general, like people don't write articles that say like, oh, if you ban the import of this product from China, there's a 6.4% chance that like, the trade war will escalate. It just doesn't happen like that, right? So you do have to convince people. But I think too, like, there is kind of this intuitive recognizing that it's not everything, but like, I like Mr. Dolan's, like how we're going to position ourselves in the world, how we're going to relate to other people. Like, I think that appeal to like a lot of judges. Because look, people are, if Biden wins, and there's obviously probably a pretty good chance he will, people are going to be kind of just wondering that, okay, like what's next? Right? Not just like domestically, but like in terms of foreign policy. And I think they'll probably reward you for kind of thinking through that a bit, like at least intuitively, like mentally. I'm not saying they're just going to vote for you, but I think they'll think, well, gee, you're a good debater. Because, we know some PF judges too, they vote for the team that like, I think they're pretty good. They came up with like some smart arguments. So I voted pro. Right? And you don't always like those decisions, but like that's a reality. Right. So I think arguments like that, even if they kind of don't outweigh the con argument, they don't outweigh ally prolif, like you're going to get a lot from a judge out of that. There might be something in the, let me see, there's something else in the chat. I don't know what all those comments mean, but yeah. All right, anything else? All right, well, thanks for coming. I hope you got something out of it. The kind of the basic contours of the topic, plus our creative arguments. Maybe we'll try to have some other classes. We had a pretty good attendance today, so.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it.
Good luck to everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.